Hi folks, today I'm going to talk to you about various types of greenhouses. This episode was brought to you by our Patreon contributors and by trueaquaponics.com. They have a lot of great things on their forum and on their website about nutrient deficiencies. By greenlifeplanet.net, serving Trinidad with all your aquaponic needs. And by glassbottleoutlet.com. They have all kinds of really great storage bottles, all made out of glass. I get asked all kinds of questions about various greenhouse designs, including our geodesic dome, standard greenhouses, hoop houses, all types of energy efficient styles. So I wanted to go over a few of the pros and cons of various designs. This information I'm going to give you is based off of years of observations and opinions about growing in this type of climate. So we're really dealing with a lot of the northern, colder areas. If you live down the south, you should definitely look into different design considerations and your terrain, humidity, temperature, amount of sunlight. It all plays into factors about how you decide on what type of greenhouse that you want to get. So just because of my opinion on a particular thing may not pertain to your area. Hi there, just wanted to add a quick little segment into this. I just finished editing the main content of the video and noticed that it was quite lengthy. If you like these longer ones, let me know down in the comments below. Also, while I was filming this, it was a little over 100 degrees in the greenhouse and probably shouldn't have done it inside. It was quite hot by the time I was done rambling on, and I think I was getting a little delirious towards the end. I edited most of that out, but it does look like I am a lot grumpier than I usually am in my videos. But I hope you enjoy it anyways. Thanks! So first we'll start off with a standard round arch greenhouse. These are relatively inexpensive to purchase and assemble. They're very simple structures and typically don't have a foundation. You just take a bunch of poles and pound them into the ground and then set the framework onto those poles. So because of that, there's no foundation that's required, and in some areas, again, you should check in your area, you usually don't need a building permit or have to pay taxes on that type of a structure. But you definitely should make sure that you're okay to build in your area. Some zoning issues may crop up on you. With this style of greenhouse, you can make them fairly large. They can be hundreds of feet long if you want them to be. They're very easy to set up with length. They just keep on going and going. And they also have excellent lighting. Basically, you get morning to evening sun from one side to the other if you have them laid from north to south. And with the winter exposure here, we're at 24 degrees for our worst case scenario for light coming in. So you get light coming in through the end wall and of course through the top still. And then during the summer, we're at about 72 degrees for our angle of sun during the summer. So we have a fairly large span, and this style of greenhouse can accommodate all that light. Some of the cons with this greenhouse is typically because they're so inexpensive, they usually use a single layer or double wall film. That can last for 4 to 5 years and then needs to be replaced. So when you are looking into this style of greenhouse, you do need to make sure you budget for replacing your plastic every few years. Because of the thin wall film, they are fairly expensive to heat. Most of the growers around here usually just shut down over the winter, especially if they're using a single wall film. The double wall films, usually they're inflated, so you get some insulation value out of that, but you're also running a blower to keep that film inflated. I've seen several hoop houses that are made with PVC conduit, something that I don't recommend around here at all. First, as the UV will slowly degrade that PVC unless you take the time to paint it. And during the winter especially, the PVC can get extremely brittle. One hit and the whole thing can shatter. So typically around here, the greenhouses would be made out of galvanized steel tubing, either round or square tubing. So under snow loads, these things are pretty poor. They have very bad strength from the snow loads because they have a rounded top. It's easy for the snow to sit along the top. And around here, we can be anywhere over 50 pounds per cubic foot for snow, and you start piling a good storm on top of your greenhouse and you get a foot of snow on your structure. That's equivalent to having a full-grown adult male standing on top of your greenhouse every 3 feet or so. It's a lot of weight, it adds up quickly, and these things will just buckle and collapse under that kind of weight. so not the greatest under a snow load. So moving on to a similar style as the Gothic arch greenhouse. These are also fairly inexpensive to purchase and assemble, usually a little bit more expensive just because of the way that the tubing is bent. Again, they don't require a foundation, so you can usually get away with not having to deal with building permits or paying taxes in the long term. Again, they can also be very large structures. You just keep adding on to the ends of them. Have very good lighting throughout the season. And they have excellent snow removal because they come up to a point when the snow lands on them, it can usually just slide right off onto the sides. What you do need to be careful about is getting too much snow buildup along the sides of the greenhouse, and that weight can actually buckle the structure and collapse it in from the sides. So typically, if you do have heavy storms, it's good to keep the area cleared, snowplow or snowblower the snow away from the structure. Again, the film can only last 4 to 5 years usually to cover them. So typically they're just covered with the single or double wall film. Again, fairly expensive to heat because of the poor R value of that film. And they do have a slightly better structural strength than a standard round arch, mainly because of keeping that snow off of it. One thing that a lot of growers with round or Gothic style hoop houses will do will either add a post in the center during the winter, and that's used just to support the structure from snow load. It works great, it's very simple. However, you do start losing some of that floor space that you have by putting that pole in the middle of your structure. And if you are dealing with deep water culture beds, people usually aren't big fans of sticking poles in the middle of their beds. Another option, which usually comes with the greenhouses, is just a crossbar that connects one side to the other. This works really well for distributing some of the weight load in the greenhouse. And then as you start getting into larger structures, they'll usually start putting trusses into these greenhouses, and that's excellent for distributing the weight across that structure. So moving on to our next greenhouse, it's just a traditional style greenhouse. Most people have seen these. One of the nice things about these is they are typically an engineered structure, can become quite large. You'll see these a lot at educational facilities, mainly because of the engineered designs. They have been calculated out and proven to be able to withstand certain snow loads, so the schools can easily get their insurance covered with that. So usually the schools have a little bit more money to spend on a greenhouse through grants and whatnot, so they will definitely invest in that. As being a standard grower, a lot of people can't afford to do an engineered greenhouse. They aren't all engineered, but typically when you get into these larger structures with trusses in them, they typically are. Again, this type of building has excellent lighting through the end walls and overhead. They have fairly good snow removal because of the pitch of the roof. It just drops off. Again, I would recommend clearing any snow away from the edges. And it is really an excellent long-term structure. So if you're planning on a family farm that is going to have multi-generations, these buildings can last for many, many years. Typically with this style of building, because all the walls and the ceilings have straight lines, it's easy to add vents into them. With the Gothic arch style, because of the curvature of the building, it can be tricky to get a vent to close properly against the structure. I've seen these covered in single layer poly, double poly, rigid plastics such as the polycarbonate, Solex, and even glass. My grandfather's greenhouses, since they were so old, they were built in the 50s and 60s, they were all covered in glass. Some of the cons with these greenhouses: they can be slightly less expensive to heat if they're covered in a polycarbonate or Solex, but if you cover them in a plastic, it's usually a fairly large span to have to cover with a single layer plastic. These buildings usually need a foundation. There are very few that I've seen that don't have foundations, so once the foundation kicks in, typically the building permits and other taxes start in. A derivative of this structure is gutter connect greenhouses, and these are really good if you're doing a really large operation where you just want to make one single large building, and the end walls are essentially connected. The slope of the roof connects in the center, and all the water goes in through there and then drains out of the end. So very, very good for doing large operations. However, with this style of greenhouse up in the north, The snow likes to collect in that gutter area and can add a lot of weight into these greenhouses. Going back to my grandfather's greenhouses being glass, he had gutter connect greenhouses, and he would have to heat his greenhouses extra over the winter when there's going to be a storm, and basically melt the snow off through the glass. Back in the 70s, that was no big deal because fuel oil was really cheap, but nowadays it's usually not in people's budget to just burn fuel to help melt snow. So you do have to watch the snow removal on these. On to our next style of greenhouse is the Gothic / traditional. It's very difficult to find a true name for this style. A lot of manufacturers have their own trade names for these. But essentially it's sort of a Gothic style mixed with a traditional style greenhouse, where it's made with bent tubing, so you still have rounded corners on it, but it still has straight lines on it too. They're relatively inexpensive to purchase because it's still sort of like a high tunnel type greenhouse, but they usually will have some type of a truss mechanism built into it to deal with the weight distribution from the snow. I've seen these both with and without foundations. Of course, foundations usually will need a building permit. You can usually make these fairly large structures with nice spans. You have excellent lighting coming in overhead and through the end walls, and are pretty good with the snow removal since you have that nice pitched roof. It can slide right off. With this style, because of the flat areas, it is fairly easy to add ridge vents or roll-up sides to help deal with some passive cooling. So if you want to try to save some money on electricity, you can usually spend a little bit more on different types of venting and whatnot. Again, some of the cons with these, usually they're covered in single or double walled film, another 4 or 5 years to replace. But many of them are covered in more rigid plastic like polycarbonate or the Solex. And the heating cost varies a little bit depending on the type of coverage that you're putting on this greenhouse. So these are very popular greenhouses, and if you're just going to plan on building one style of greenhouse, this is usually a good one that most people choose if they need to buy one from a commercial operation. Okay, moving on to some of our more non-traditional greenhouses. Of course, I have to mention the geodesic dome. That's what we have here currently. They are moderately to expensive in price per square foot. The problem with these is that they are so unique, it can be difficult to get any approval from your building official to put them up without engineered designs. They just aren't familiar enough with how the strength of these are. They have excellent lighting. We get great lighting in here from east to west, morning to night, and through the different seasons with the low to higher pitch light. They have excellent strength. We've had some pretty good snow on top of this building, but it also slides off very easily too because it's such a steep pitch. We just usually get a little bit of snow added at the top. These are usually covered in polycarbonate just because it's easy to cut it and have them individual pieces. So that will help add to the cost of it. And this one has very good passive cooling in it. So the vents open up. With a higher roof in it, the heat comes right out through the top of the building. So they are fairly good with keeping cool. Some of the cons with this structure: it's a round shape, so it's difficult to have an efficient bed layout used for commercial use. It's one of the primary reasons why I wouldn't build one if I was going to do a commercial operation. It's just too hard to do assembly line type growing with long deep water culture beds. It's not too bad to heat, but it does have to be heated. It's not a highly energy efficient building. And it does require here a foundation once we got into this size. I have seen some smaller ones where they'll just pound posts into the ground or put sonic tubes into the ground and anchor it to that. But for the most part, once you get into these larger structures, it needs a building permit and needs a foundation. This dome's 33 feet across, so it's roughly 850 square feet. You can get some larger ones like the 42-foot dome that's about 1,300 square feet. So from going from a 33 to 42-foot dome, you're gaining about 500 square feet, which is pretty insignificant when you're trying to do a larger commercial operation. Plus, when you go to these larger domes, they have much higher head height, so you're now heating a lot of extra head space or trying to recover some of that heat up above, which is really unnecessary to have that much volume inside the building. Next up is the Wallapini or pit greenhouse. These are a pretty neat greenhouse, relatively inexpensive to build. However, for us, it would be fairly expensive to build. Typically, you'll see some of these online where they're using sandbags on the walls or cinder blocks or something like that. Because we're going down underground here, a lot of excavation work has to be done. So first, we're getting through a lot of rock. And secondly, because technically it's a foundation, you need the building permit. You're now down underground, so it usually is a little bit thicker concrete wall because you're going to have people inside of that, so it has to be a reinforced concrete wall. So economically, for us, these buildings don't make sense. So one of the nice features about these greenhouses is them being underground is during the summer you have that cool thermal mass coming in through the walls to help keep the structure cool. But again, it's difficult to deal with these on a commercial size because once you make them large enough, you still are going to have a huge amount of roof space, and your proportions of roof to walls helping to keep the structure cold just becomes disproportionate, and it becomes ineffective at that point. These units also have fairly poor morning and evening light. In the morning, the sun is coming up in the east side, so you get a lot of shadowing from your concrete walls, and it takes a couple hours to start getting some better light into there. And also one of the biggest problems I have with these types of structure is that because you're down underground, it's very easy to get onto the roof of these things. So you can get livestock or people walking right onto that roof, and if it's just a standard film, they're going to fall right through this thing. So I'm not a huge fan of these in our particular area. I've seen people using them all winter long without any heat, usually down in the south, so they don't have quite as cold weather as we do. But for around here, personally, I can't recommend this style of a greenhouse. All right, next up is our passive solar greenhouse. Now these started becoming really popular in the 70s. You'll see a lot of them attached onto houses for the hobby growers. They are extremely energy efficient. They get fairly good lighting coming through. Usually they're covered in a polycarbonate or glass. They have excellent snow removal, especially around here because the pitch to the south facing is supposed to be at the winter solstice angle. So you are really at about 24 degrees on that pitch, so everything slides right off of these. Usually the north side of the wall is well insulated or is bermed or is attached to a house. So you get some good insulated properties from that north side of the wall. Usually they need a building permit because they have to sit on a foundation. They get fairly poor morning and evening light from the east or the west. Typically these have insulated walls on those sides, so it takes a few hours for that sun to come around, similar to the pit greenhouses. So I have seen a few of these where they do put glass or plastic on the east and west sides. However, then you start losing some of that insulated value that you had with this type of building. One of the biggest problems I have with this type of structure is trying to make them large enough for a commercial operation. Because of the angle of that south-facing window, to make the building wider for more square footage, your wall height gets really high. So it's difficult to scale these to fit for a commercial operation. Also with these, they work really well, but typically people will put 55-gallon drums filled with water up against the north wall. So as the sun is coming in during the winter months, it hits those barrels and helps them warm them up, and then they radiate their heat into the building during the night. During the summer, when the sun is high, basically the way that the roof structure works on those barrels are shaded so they aren't retaining any extra heat. However, I think every greenhouse of this style that I've seen that has barrels in it, there are usually so many plants inside that greenhouse that the barrels never even see any sunlight. So they're sort of being defeated by the plants and not retaining any heat over the winter. And now you're wasting square footage in your building for holding barrels that are essentially useless. So you have to decide either keep those barrels clear or not put barrels in and use that space for growing extra food. Probably one of my favorite style of greenhouses is the Chinese greenhouse. Basically, they are south-facing, have a lot of glazing on them, and then there's a north wall that is well insulated or bermed to help retain some of that heat. Usually they're covered in a polycarbonate or some type of a plastic film, and in some areas they'll actually use an insulative cloth, like a roll-up cloth that comes down overnight with that. For me, it's not something that I'd be willing to do, having to deal with snow and trying to get snow off of an insulative cover and then spending every day rolling and unrolling that. That's not something that I would want to have to deal with. They have fairly good snow removal. About half of it is sloped enough to get most of the snow off. And the other, in the upper area where the roof line isn't quite as steep, a roof rake is easy enough to pull that snow off. So they're fairly good with snow removal. You just have a large pile of snow at the end that you have to remove. Most of these, especially the well-engineered ones, have very good cooling in them. Usually that south side front has some vents that open up, a couple of vents up at the top, and you get really good cross ventilation right through it. They're fairly moderate in price. If you do a small one, they're fairly easy to build. The biggest problem with these that I have is when you start getting into a commercial size where you want them to span 26 or 36 feet, that span is quite large and usually needs to be supported with some type of a beam system, or each run up there needs to be trellised somehow. So that can start getting into odd engineered calculations and whatnot. So typically that's why we don't see these on really large structures. This, again, just like some of the other larger greenhouses, usually needs a foundation, again, building permits and all that fun stuff. And it is sort of difficult to make these large enough for commercial operations. I have seen greenhouses like this that they're just lined up one after another, but they are still individual buildings. So I still would lean towards more of a gutter style greenhouse to connect if you wanted everything all within one space. And with these, because typically the end walls are insulated and that's where your doors and some of the fans might be located, the end walls usually don't have any light coming in, so you're having to wait for some of that solar for later in the day. I've mentioned a couple times about poor light in the morning, and it's fairly important, at least in our area, to try to get light into that greenhouse as soon as possible, because at night you get a lot of moisture condensating onto the plants and it increases your risk of getting various diseases. So a lot of growers around here will usually try to get those plants dried off as quickly as possible. So that's why a lot of these greenhouses I almost immediately rule out, just because I can't get enough light into them early in the morning. One way to get around that is, instead of running your greenhouses north and south directly, you can cockeye them a little bit so that you can try to get some earlier morning light into them. Of course, our last option for doing a setup is doing no greenhouse at all, just using the great outdoors. Obviously, it doesn't cost you anything to do that and has excellent lighting all day long. And of course, you don't need any permits or taxes, foundations, and not a whole lot of site work. Just level off a site for your grow beds. However, that's very seasonal, especially around here. It's no different than growing in a regular garden or field at that point. And you also run the risk of animals getting into your food fairly easily. Even though with our greenhouse here, I leave the doors open all summer long. We don't get any woodchucks or anything like that wandering in here. Once again, I want to thank all my Patreon subscribers for helping to sponsor this video and our future greenhouse expansion plans. The diagrams and some of the notes for this video are posted on our premium website, so head on over to our site or to Patreon to see details on how you can access that. Thanks for watching.